No one ever warns you that the most dangerous sentence in a marriage isn't shouted in anger. It's said calmly, almost carelessly. I'm tired of you. That was all it took. Not a scandal. Not betrayal. Not dramatic fight that shook the walls. Just 6 quiet words spoken by a millionaire who believed love would always wait for him. Before we go any further, let me ask you something real. Have you ever watched someone slowly stop seeing you, even while standing right in front of them? Have you ever stayed, hoping effort would eventually be noticed, only to realize too late that silence had replaced affection? If that question hits close to home, you're not alone. Welcome, new and returning listeners, to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. If stories about love, loss, and life-changing lessons move you, please take a moment to subscribe now. These stories aren't just meant to entertain. They're meant to stay with you long after the video ends. Because the story you're about to hear isn't really about money. It's about what happens when success becomes louder than presence. When ambition crowds out intimacy, and when the person who believed in you first becomes the easiest one to neglect. Tonight's story begins in a beautiful home most people would dream of living in. Marble countertops, soft lighting, a kitchen that looked like belonged in a magazine. And yet, inside that kitchen, a woman realized she had never felt more alone. When Alaric Vaughn, self-made millionaire, respected executive, admired leader, said he was tired of his wife, he thought he was ending a phase of his life that no longer served him. What he didn't know was that his wife had already been preparing her goodbye. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of clarity. She would leave without raising her voice, without begging, without asking to be chosen. And months later, when Alaric believed he had moved on, when success once again filled his days, she would send him one final gift. A gift so quiet, so deliberate, that it would dismantle everything he thought he understood about love, regret, and fulfillment. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll understand why love doesn't always leave loudly, why the people who give the most often walk away silently, and why some lessons only arrive after it's far too late to fix what you broke. Let's begin. The kitchen was too clean for a conversation like that. Not a dish out of place. Not a sound beyond the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant city outside the windows. Serena stood across from Alaric, her fingers resting lightly on the back of a chair she had chosen years ago, because he once said it looked warm. She noticed details in moments like this. Always had. Alaric didn't look at her when he spoke. His attention stayed on the screen of his phone, thumb scrolling, jaw relaxed, like he had rehearsed this in his head long before deciding to say it out loud. I can't stand being with you anymore, he added, as if clarifying a business decision. The words didn't land all at once. They arrived slowly, one by one, each one settling somewhere deep in her chest. Serena waited for the familiar surge. Tears, panic, the instinct to fix things. Didn't come. Instead, there was a strange calm, the kind that arrives only after exhaustion has burned every other emotion away. 17 years. That was how long she had loved this man. She remembered him when his suits were borrowed confidence, and his dreams were scribbled on cheap notepads. She remembered believing in him so fiercely that she never questioned whether he would one day believe in her the same way. But standing there now, she understood something with painful clarity. This wasn't a sudden ending. It was a delayed one. Alaric finally looked up when she didn't respond. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. Not concern, not fear, just comfort. Silence made him uneasy. Silence meant consequences. "Well?" he asked. "You're going to anything." Serena lifted her eyes to meet his. For a moment, Alaric felt something shift. He couldn't name it, but it felt like the room had tilted, like he had stepped too far forward without realizing the ground was gone. "I hear you," she said quietly. That was all. No accusation, no defense, no desperate promise to change. Just acceptance. Alaric exhaled, relieved. He mistook her calm for agreement. "Good," he said. "I don't want this to turn into a whole thing." A whole thing. Serena almost smiled at that, because what he didn't know, what he couldn't see yet, was that this was the whole thing, the final piece clicking into place. The moment she stopped hoping he would notice what he was losing. That night, Serena didn't sleep. She lay awake beside him, listening to the familiar rhythm of his breathing, studying the ceiling they had once chosen together. She thought about all the times she had swallowed her needs because his goals felt bigger, about the dinners eaten alone, the celebrations postponed, the conversations that ended with, "We'll talk later." Later never came. By morning, she had made a decision that surprised even her. Not fueled by anger, not driven by revenge, but guided by something steadier, self-respect. She packed carefully, thoughtfully. One suitcase, only what she needed. She left behind the rest. Furniture, clothes, memories that belonged to a version of herself she no longer wanted to be. Before she left, she paused at the dining table. The note she placed there was simple. No explanations, no pleas, just gratitude for what had been, and clarity about what could no longer be. When the door closed behind her, there was no dramatic sound, just a soft click, the sound of a life-changing direction. Alaric didn't notice right away. That was the cruelest part. For days, he moved through the house, untouched by absence. Meetings ran late. Emails stacked up. Success continued doing what it always had, demanding more while giving less. It wasn't until the silence stretched too long that something felt off, not wrong, empty, and that was when the cost of his words began to surface. But Serena was already gone, not just from the house, but from the role she had played for years. And somewhere far from marble counters and polished floors, She was about to rediscover who she had been before loving him required disappearing. The first thing Alaric noticed wasn't loneliness. It was convenience. No reminders. No conversations waiting at the end of the day. No one asking him to slow down, to sit, to be present. The house operated exactly the way he liked his life. Too quiet, efficient, undemanding. For the first week, Serena's absence felt like relief. He woke early, worked late, and ate when it suited him. Meetings filled every gap that might have invited reflection. At night, he slept on his side of the bed, without reaching for someone who no longer expected his touch. When he found the note on the dining table, it barely registered. Short, polite, grateful, no accusations, no anger. He read it once, then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer, telling himself he'd deal with it later. Later had always been his answer. At work, nothing slowed down. If anything, his focus sharpened. Colleagues praised his discipline. Investors admired his clarity. His calendar filled weeks in advance. From the outside, Alaric Vaughn looked untouched. That illusion lasted longer than he expected. But absence has a way of announcing itself when distractions fail. It began with small things. The bookshelf in the living room, still organized by color, exactly how Serena had arranged it years ago. He had never questioned it. Now, every time he passed it, the order felt deliberate, intentional, like proof that someone once cared enough to make things beautiful for no reward. The guest room remained untouched. Serena had used it as a studio, a quiet place where she read, wrote, and sometimes just sat with her thoughts. Alaric couldn't remember the last time he had asked her what she did in there. Now, the closed door felt like an unanswered question. At night, the silence changed. It no longer felt productive. It felt heavy. He caught himself glancing at his phone, expecting a message that never came. No updates, no check-ins, no gentle reminders masked as concern. Weeks passed. Still, he didn't call. Pride whispered that she would reach out first. Ego insisted this was temporary. Habit told him that time would smooth everything over, the way it always had. But Serena didn't come back. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Alaric's confidence began to erode. Nah in meetings, nod in negotiations, but in the quiet moments no one else saw. He started noticing how often he avoided going home, how he lingered at the office long after emails were answered, how the house no longer felt like a place of rest, but something he needed to escape. It bothered him more than he wanted to admit, because success had always responded to effort. Love, apparently, did not. Meanwhile, miles away, Serena stood at the edge of a small coastal town she had chosen without consulting anyone. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, steady, patient, unconcerned with status or achievement. The air smelled different here, cleaner, slower. Her apartment was modest, light-filled, imperfect, and it felt like freedom. For the first time in years, she woke without dread. No schedule to accommodate someone else's ambitions. No waiting for attention that might never arrive. She found work that paid less but gave more. The kind of work that ended with a sense of completion rather than depletion. She walked in the mornings, read in the afternoons, slept deeply at night, and gradually she began to feel whole again. It wasn't easy. Healing never is. There were moments she missed him, not the man he had become, but the man he once was, the man who listened, the man who dreamed aloud, the man who saw her. But each time nostalgia tugged at her, she reminded herself why she left. Love that requires shrinking is not love. It's survival. And Serena was done surviving. Months passed before she began preparing what would become her final act, not as a wife, but as someone who had once loved deeply and refused to leave with bitterness. She didn't do it for closure. She did it, for truth. Back in the city, Alaric stood in his office one late afternoon, staring at a skyline he had conquered piece by piece. The view used to thrill him. Now it felt distant. He told himself it was stress, fatigue, a phase. He didn't yet understand that some losses don't announce themselves loudly. They wait, they mature, and when they arrive, they do so with devastating clarity. What Alaric didn't know, what he couldn't know yet, was that the most painful consequence of his words wasn't Serena's absence. It was what she was quietly preparing to give him. And when that gift finally arrived, it would force him to confront a truth no amount of money could soften. The truth that love, once neglected long enough, does not return. It teaches, then it leaves. Before we move forward, let me ask you something important. If you were in Alaric's place, would you recognize the moment you crossed the line, or would you only realize it after silence replaced love? This story is just beginning, and what happens next will reveal how neglect quietly transforms into regret. If this chapter made you reflect, even for a moment, please tap the like button. It helps this story reach others who may need it. And if you believe stories about love, loss, and life lessons matter, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson so you don't miss what comes next. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Do you think Serena did the right thing by leaving quietly? Or should she have fought harder? Let's continue to Chapter 2, where we return to the days before the money, when love was simple, hopeful, and still untouched by success. Before the world knew Alaric Vaughan's name, before conference stages and magazine features, there was a narrow apartment above a closed-down bookstore that smelled faintly of old paper and dust. That was where Serena first fell in love with him. Not because he had anything impressive to offer, but because he had everything that mattered. Back then, Alaric's life was small by most standards. A folding table served as a desk. His laptop was outdated. His suits were inexpensive, worn carefully, so they'd last. But his mind was always racing, alive with ideas that spilled out faster than he could organize them. Serena used to sit across from him in the evenings, a mug of tea cooling between her hands, listening as he talked himself through dreams that sounded impossible. He never noticed the tea growing cold. She noticed everything else. The way his eyes lit up when something clicked. The way his voice softened when he admitted he was afraid. The way he looked relieved, not impressed, when she said, "I believe you." Those words became the foundation of their relationship. Belief. They didn't have much money, but they had rituals. Late dinners eaten on the floor. Long walks through neighborhoods they couldn't yet afford. Quiet laughter that filled spaces without needing permission. Alaric worked endlessly. He studied markets, tracked patterns, and chased opportunities with relentless focus. But in those early years, he always made time for Serena. He asked her opinion. He shared his doubts. He listened, and Serena gave without counting. She edited his presentations, helped him rehearse pitches, encouraged him after rejection emails that arrived far more often than acceptance. She learned to read his silences and sit with him through disappointment without trying to fix it. Love, then, was not loud. It was patient. When Alaric finally landed his first major break, a contract that would change everything, they celebrated with takeout and cheap champagne. He talked about the future as if it were something they were building together. And Serena believed him. She believed because he looked at her. Then, the way people look at home. But success is subtle in the beginning. It doesn't announce its arrival. It whispers promises. It demands just a little more time, just a little more sacrifice. And because Serena loved him, she agreed. When Alaric started staying late, she adjusted. When weekends became workdays, she adapted. When conversations shortened, she told herself it was temporary. After all, this what they had worked toward. But somewhere along the way, the balance shifted. Without noticing, Alaric began speaking about the future as if it were his alone. Not intentionally, not cruelly, just unconsciously. Serena noticed the change before he did. She noticed how questions turned into updates, how shared plans turned into assumptions, how presence was replaced by proximity. Still, she stayed hopeful, because people who love deeply don't leave at the first sign of trouble. They wait. They invest. They believe effort will be rewarded. What Serena didn't realize then, what many people don't, is that love can survive struggle, but it struggles to survive neglect. And the seeds of that neglect were already being planted. Quietly, Serena never thought of what she gave as sacrifice. To her, it was partnership. She measured love in small, ordinary ways. The way she woke before dawn to make sure Alaric ate something before rushing out the door. The way she learned his moods by the sound of his keys at night. The way she kept her own dreams folded neatly, so his could stretch without resistance. In those years, believing in him felt natural. When rejection emails arrived, she sat beside him and reminded him that setbacks were not verdicts. When opportunities slipped through his fingers, she reframed them as lessons rather than losses. She learned the language of encouragement so fluently that she barely noticed how rarely anyone spoke it back to her. Alaric did notice at first. He used to thank her, used to ask if was okay with the pace, used to say, "I couldn't do this without you." Those words mattered. They made the long nights feel shared, not endured. But as momentum built, something subtle shifted. Alaric stopped asking whether she was okay with the pace. He assumed she would be. He stopped noticing how often she rearranged her life around his schedule. He stopped seeing belief as a gift and began treating it as a given. Serena noticed the shift, but she didn't name it. Instead, she explained it away. He's under pressure. This is temporary. Once things settle, we'll reconnect. That's the quiet trap of love. You assume effort guarantees return. She delayed her own ambitions without resentment, turned down opportunities that would have required relocation or risk, told herself there would be time later, once his success stabilized. Later became a moving target. What Serena didn't realize was that belief, when unreciprocated, slowly turns into invisibility. It wasn't one moment that hurt. It was accumulation. The unanswered questions, the conversations cut short, the way his phone always seemed more urgent than her presence. She still smiled, still supported, still showed up. But something inside her grew tired, not of loving him, but of being unseen while doing it. Education often comes too late in relationships, and this was the lesson Serena was slowly learning. Love needs acknowledgement, the way fire needs oxygen. Without it, it doesn't explode. It fades. Alaric never meant to take her for granted. That was the truth, and also the problem. Neglect is rarely malicious. It's comfortable. It grows in routines. It hides behind intentions and excuses. By the time Alaric realized Serena had gone quiet, he mistook it for peace. He didn't understand that silence is often the final stage before departure, because people don't leave when they're angry. They leave when they're empty. Serena didn't stop loving him in those years. She stopped expecting to be loved back in the same way. And that difference, quiet, unspoken, deeply internal, was already reshaping the future they once dreamed of together. She just didn't know yet how high the cost would be for the man who never noticed when belief slowly turned into goodbye. Success didn't storm into Alaric's life. It crept in politely. At first, it looked like opportunity. New clients, longer meetings, flights booked with little notice. Then it became expectation. People needed him. Markets moved fast. Decisions carried weight. And slowly, without anyone announcing it, work stopped being something Alaric did and became who he was. Serena watched the change with careful eyes. She saw how pressure reshaped him, not into someone cruel, but into someone constantly elsewhere. His body might be in the room, but his mind lived 3 steps ahead, solving problems no one else could see. Conversations shifted. They used to talk about ideas, fears, possibilities. Now they talked about logistics, schedules, budgets, what needed to be handled next. Affection became efficient. A quick kiss before sleep. A distracted hug between calls. Touch without presence. Serena told herself this was the price of growth. After all, they had wanted this. But ambition is demanding. It doesn't just ask for time. It asks for attention, patience, and emotional availability. And those resources are finite. Without realizing it, Alaric began allocating his best energy to the world outside their marriage. Clients received his focus. Colleagues received his patience. Strangers received the version of him that listened. Serena received what was left. It wasn't intentional. That's what made it dangerous. He stopped asking how her day felt, only how it went. Stopped noticing when her enthusiasm dimmed. Stopped hearing the pauses in her voice where hope used to live. From the outside, they looked solid, successful, stable. Inside, Serena was slowly becoming a background character in a life she had helped build. And here is the educational truth most people learn too late. Ambition doesn't ruin relationships. Imbalance does. Love can survive long hours. It can survive stress. It can even survive temporary distance. What it struggles to survive is being consistently deprioritized. Serena didn't want luxury. She wanted presence. She didn't want praise. She wanted participation. But Alaric mistook her adaptability for resilience, and resilience for permission. The more she adjusted, the less he noticed the cost. By the time success fully settled into their lives, something essential had quietly slipped away, and neither of them understood yet that what was being lost wasn't passion. It was connection. Serena didn't wake up one morning and realize she was invisible. It happened gradually, so gradually that if someone had asked her when it started, she wouldn't have been able to answer. Invisibility doesn't arrive with absence. It arrives with adjustment. She adjusted her expectations first, then her needs, then her voice. When Alaric missed dinners, she reheated her food. When he forgot dates that once mattered, she told herself dates were just symbols. When conversations ended with him distracted, she learned to finish her thoughts silently. She became easy, and that, she would later understand, was the most dangerous thing she could have done. Because when someone becomes easy to overlook, they often are. Alaric didn't see the change, because nothing broke loudly. There were no fights, no ultimatums, no tears that demanded attention. From his perspective, things were stable, functional, good enough, and stability, when mistaken for intimacy, is comforting. Serena still smiled when needed, still showed up to events, still knew when to step back and let him shine. She was praised often by others. She's so understanding. You're lucky to have a wife like that. She never complains. Each comment landed like a quiet weight, because what no one realized, not even Alaric, was that understanding had replaced mutuality, and silence had replaced safety. She stopped sharing her inner world, because it felt like speaking into a room that echoed back empty. When she did try, Alaric listened with half his attention, nodding while thinking ahead. She began choosing solitude over disappointment. And solitude, once chosen enough times, becomes familiar. Here's the educational truth many couples miss until it's too late. People don't leave because they stop loving. They leave because they stop being seen. Serena still loved Alaric, but no longer felt chosen by him. Love without choice feels like obligation, and obligation, over time, feels like erasure. The moment that clarified everything didn't come during a fight. It came during a pause. One evening, Serena realized she could disappear from the room entirely, and nothing would change. Alaric would still be on his phone. The conversation would still move on. The world would not pause to notice her absence. That realization settled deep. She didn't confront him then. She didn't need to. Something inside her shifted from waiting to watching. And once someone starts watching, instead of hoping, they're already preparing to leave. Alaric would later replay these years in his mind, searching for warning signs. He would remember stability and mistake it for peace. But peace is mutual. What they had was quiet imbalance, and that imbalance, unspoken, unaddressed, was already writing the ending of their marriage. Serena just hadn't said goodbye yet. There was no moment when Alaric decided to stop choosing his marriage. That's the part he would struggle to accept later. In his mind, he was still doing everything right, providing, building, securing a future most people only dreamed of. He told himself that love didn't need constant attention once it was established. That stability was proof of commitment. He believed consistency was enough. What he didn't understand was that consistency without connection slowly drains meaning from even the strongest bond. From Alaric's perspective, Serena was fine. She wasn't angry. She wasn't demanding. She wasn't threatening to leave. In fact, she seemed calmer than ever. And calm, when misunderstood, can be dangerously misleading. He mistook her emotional withdrawal for maturity, her silence for strength, her endurance for contentment. This is one of the most common relationship blind spots. When someone stops asking for more, we assume they no longer need it. But often, they've simply stopped believing they'll receive it. Serena noticed the shift long before Alaric did. She felt it in the way he spoke around her instead of to her, in the way decisions were announced rather than discussed, in how her role quietly changed from partner to supporter, from equal to accessory. She was no longer part of the conversation. She was part of the background, and the more invisible she became, the more she internalized the belief that asking for presence would be a burden, that wanting connection would feel like interruption. So she adapted. Adaptation is praised in relationships, but unchecked, it becomes self-erasure. Serena told herself that loving someone meant making room for their growth, even if it meant shrinking herself temporarily. She convinced herself that this phase would pass, that once Alaric reached a certain milestone, things would rebalance. But ambition doesn't slow down on its own. It accelerates. And every time Serena chose understanding over expression, the distance widened just enough to feel, but not enough to alarm. Alaric began assuming she would always be there. Always patient. Always flexible. Always supportive. Assumption is the quiet enemy of intimacy. It replaces curiosity with certainty, presence with prediction. And once love becomes predictable, it's often taken for granted. Serena didn't want grand gestures. She wanted to be asked, to be included, to be remembered without reminders. But each unacknowledged moment taught her something painful. She was no longer essential to his inner world. That realization didn't make her angry. It made her tired, and emotional fatigue, when ignored, doesn't ask for attention. It prepares for exit. Alaric would later wonder how he missed the signs, how someone could leave without warning. The truth was simpler and harder to accept. The warning signs were quiet, because the love leaving was quiet too. And by the time love turns into obligation, the relationship has already crossed a dangerous threshold, one that can only be reversed with awareness or ended with silence. People often assume that leaving is the hardest part of an unhappy marriage. It isn't. Staying is. Staying requires daily justification. Staying requires hope that keeps reshaping itself to survive disappointment. Staying requires telling yourself stories that make pain feel temporary. Serena stayed because she remembered who Alaric used to be. She stayed because history has weight, and shared beginnings feel sacred. She stayed because walking away from a life you helped build feels like admitting failure, even when the failure isn't yours. And most of all, she stayed because love had taught her endurance long before it taught her limits. She told herself that all marriages go through seasons like this. That emotional distance was normal when ambition was involved. That patience was a virtue, not a warning sign. These are the quiet lies people tell themselves to make unhappiness feel noble. Education rarely comes from textbooks in moments like this. It comes from lived experience. And the truth Serena was slowly learning was this: staying makes sense until it starts costing you yourself. She stayed because she didn't want to be dramatic, because she didn't want to pressure him, because she didn't want to compete with his work for attention. So she minimized her needs, and minimized needs don't disappear. They wait. They settle into the body as fatigue, as numbness, as a sense of being slightly disconnected from your own life. Serena noticed how often she felt tired even after resting, how laughter came less easily, how joy felt muted, like it was happening behind glass. She was still functioning, but she was no longer flourishing. Alaric, meanwhile, interpreted her quiet as stability. In his mind, the absence of conflict meant the absence of problems. He had never learned that some of the most dangerous relationship breakdowns happen without raised voices. Here's the educational truth many people miss. Conflict can be repaired. Silence is harder to reach because silence doesn't ask for resolution. It accepts. Serena accepted less than she needed for longer than she should have. Not because she was weak, but because she was loyal to the version of love she believed in. But loyalty, when it's one-sided, slowly becomes self-betrayal. The turning point wasn't when she stopped loving Alaric. It was when she realized she had been living as an accessory to someone else's life. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with clarity. And clarity is dangerous to a relationship built on assumption. Because once someone understands why they are unhappy, staying becomes a choice instead of a habit. Serena didn't announce that choice. She didn't threaten. She didn't demand change. She simply began preparing herself, emotionally, mentally, quietly, for a life where love did not require her to disappear. Alaric would later say there was no warning. But the truth was, there had been years of them. They just didn't sound like alarms. They sounded like silence. The decision didn't come to Serena in a rush of emotion. There was no breaking point that sent her running into the night. No dramatic scene where words finally spilled over after years of restraint. Instead, it arrived quietly on an ordinary morning that looked exactly like all the others. She stood at the kitchen sink, watching sunlight stretch across the counter, and realized something with unsettling calm. She could keep living like this. And that was the problem, because the thought didn't comfort her. It frightened her. She understood then that if she didn't leave now, she might never leave at all. That she would slowly normalize emptiness until it felt like routine. That one day, years later, she would look back and wonder when she stopped choosing herself. That was the moment she knew. Not fueled by anger, not driven by desperation, but guided by self-respect. Serena didn't confront Alaric after that realization. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been expressed through years of patience. She understood something many people never do. You don't always need permission to leave what is hurting you. You only need honesty. She began preparing quietly, not because she was afraid of him, but because she was protecting herself. Quiet preparation gave her clarity. It allowed her to leave without turning pain into spectacle. She sorted through her life carefully. What she packed mattered less than what she left behind. She left the clothes she wore for him, the versions of herself that existed only to accommodate, the expectations she had been carrying alone. She took only what felt like hers. Memories, though, were harder. They surfaced uninvited, the laughter from earlier years, the warmth that once felt effortless. Those memories didn't stop her. They reminded her why she had stayed as long as she did. Love had been real. That mattered. But love, she had learned, doesn't justify erasure. The night before she left, Serena sat at the dining table long after Alaric had gone to bed. The house was silent in the way that had once felt familiar, and now felt instructive. She wrote the note slowly, not to explain, not to accuse, but to close the door with dignity. She thanked him for the years, for the growth, for the love they once shared. She made it clear she wasn't leaving because of one sentence, one fight, or one failure. She was leaving because she had finally understood herself. That staying had begun to cost more than leaving ever would. When dawn came, Serena packed the last of her things. One suitcase, no excess, no hesitation. She walked through the house once more, not with longing, but with awareness. She noticed how little of herself remained in the space, how easily she could imagine her absence fitting into the quiet. At the door, she paused, not to reconsider, but to acknowledge the courage it took to choose peace over familiarity. Then she left. The door closed softly behind her, and in that moment, unnoticed, uncelebrated, Serena reclaimed her life. Alaric was still asleep. He would wake to a house that looked unchanged, and never realize that something irreplaceable had already gone missing. Alaric didn't notice the difference right away. That was the cruel irony of it all. When he woke that morning, the house looked exactly the same. The curtains filtered in the same soft light. The coffee machine sat untouched on the counter. The silence felt familiar. He assumed Serena had gone out early. That assumption followed him through the morning, through emails, through meetings, through decisions that affected thousands of people. It wasn't until late afternoon, when the house remained quiet in a way that no longer felt temporary, that something unsettled him. He called her name once. No answer. He checked his phone. No message. No missed call. The note waited on the dining table, placed with the same care Serena had always used when setting things in order. He read it standing up, then again sitting down. It was calm, too calm. There were no demands, no accusations, no ultimatums, just clarity, just truth. And for the first time in a long while, Alaric felt something he couldn't schedule away. Discomfort, not panic, not grief, but the quiet awareness that something had shifted beyond his control. Still, he didn't chase her. Not that day. Not that week. He told himself she needed space, that this was temporary, that she would come back once emotions cooled. Pride filled the gaps where urgency should have lived. That's another lesson few people are taught early enough. When someone leaves quietly, it's rarely impulsive. It's usually final. Serena, meanwhile, was already settling into her new life. The coastal town welcomed her without ceremony. No one knew her history. No one expected her to be anyone's support system. She rented a small place with sunlight that reached every corner by mid-morning. The first night alone felt strange, but not lonely. There was grief. Yes, grief for what had been, for what never fully became. But beneath the grief was relief. Relief that she no longer had to measure her worth by someone else's availability. She began rebuilding in small ways. Morning walks, simple meals, work that ended without emails waiting afterward. For the first time in years, her time felt like her own. Healing wasn't immediate. Some days were harder than others. Memories surfaced unexpectedly. Certain songs still caught her off guard, but the weight she had been carrying for so long slowly began to lift. She slept better. She laughed more easily. She noticed herself again. Back in the city, Alaric's life continued at full speed, but something underneath it all felt misaligned. He stayed later at work, took more calls, filled every silence with motion. But distraction has limits. There were moments, standing alone in the kitchen, passing the guest room door, noticing the absence of small, thoughtful details, when unease crept in. Still, he didn't call, because calling would mean acknowledging that her leaving mattered. And that acknowledgement would require reflection. Reflection, for someone like Alaric, felt far more threatening than loss. Weeks passed, then months, and Serena did not return. What neither of them knew yet was that distance doesn't always close stories. Sometimes it prepares the final chapter. Serena wasn't planning revenge. She wasn't hoping to hurt him, but she was preparing something. Not out of bitterness, out of truth. And when the time came, the man who believed success had insulated him from consequence would learn something he had never learned before. Some departures are not meant to be undone. They are meant to be understood. Before we move on, pause with me for a moment. Have you ever stayed in a place, or with a person, longer than you should have, simply because leaving felt harder than enduring? Serena didn't leave in anger. She left in clarity. And that choice is one many people don't understand until they're forced to face it themselves. If this chapter resonated with you, please tap the like button. It tells the algorithm and me that stories like this matter to you. And if you believe love stories should also teach real-life lessons, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson so you don't miss what comes next. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Do you think leaving quietly is stronger than fighting loudly? Or do you believe some relationships deserve one last battle? Up next is Chapter 6, where we see what happens when silence settles in and relief slowly turns into regret. At first, Alaric felt lighter. That was the part he wouldn't admit out loud. But it was true. Without Serena in the house, his life felt streamlined. No emotional check-ins, no quiet expectations waiting at the end of the day, no subtle tension he couldn't quite name, but always felt. For a man who thrived on efficiency, the silence felt productive. He worked longer hours without guilt, took meetings late into the evening when he remembered, slept when exhaustion finally claimed him. The house became a place to pass through, not a place to return to. And for a while, he convinced himself this was better. This is what many people mistake for healing. Relief is not recovery. Silence is not peace. But in the early days, relief feels convincing. At the office, Alaric's focus sharpened. Colleagues noticed. Deals moved faster. Decisions felt cleaner, without emotional distractions pulling at him. His name appeared more frequently in headlines. His calendar filled weeks in advance. From the outside, nothing had fallen apart. If anything, things looked better. This where the lesson deepens. Success often rewards emotional avoidance, at least in the short term. It applauds focus, detachment, and sacrifice. It rarely asks what those qualities cost the people closest to you. Alaric told himself Serena would come back eventually, that she needed time. That distance would reset things the way timeouts always had. But days turned into weeks. The house remained unchanged. No messages, no missed calls, no attempts to reconnect. That should have unsettled him. Instead, he filled the space. He stayed later at work, accepted invitations he would have once declined. Let noise replace reflection. Let motion replace feeling. Because stopping, even briefly, meant risking a thought he wasn't ready to face. Yet small cracks began to show. He caught himself pausing in the doorway of the kitchen, waiting for a sound that never came. He opened the refrigerator without knowing what he wanted. He stood in rooms that felt too large for one person. At night, sleep became restless, not because he missed Serena the way people expect, but because something in his life felt unfinished, unresolved. The kind of discomfort you can't schedule away. He told himself this was temporary, that every adjustment period felt strange, that independence simply took time to get used to. But deep down, beneath the confidence and control, something had begun to shift. Freedom, he was learning, only feels like victory until you realize what it has cost you. And Alaric was just beginning to notice the price. The house began to speak to him, not with sound, but with absence. It was in the way the lights stayed off in rooms he no longer used, in how the dining table remained untouched night after night, in the subtle, unexplainable heaviness that settled in once the workday ended and there was nowhere else to go. Alaric started noticing details he had ignored for years. The bookshelf Serena had organized by color. He'd never understood why she did it that way, but now the order felt intentional, like a signature left behind. The guest room door stayed closed, the space inside frozen in time. He never opened it. He didn't need to. The presence of it was enough. The relief he had felt early on began to fade, replaced by something harder to define. Discomfort, not loneliness. Not yet. Loneliness implies missing someone. This was more unsettling than that. It was the realization that his life had lost a layer of meaning he hadn't known was essential. He tried to fix it the way he fixed everything else. More work, more commitments, more movement. But discomfort doesn't respond to productivity. It waits. Nights grew longer. Sleep came later. When it did, it was shallow, restless. He woke up with thoughts he couldn't immediately silence. Why didn't she fight? Why didn't she ask him to change? Why didn't she give him a chance to fix it? The questions frustrated him. They suggested accountability, and accountability felt like accusation. Here's the truth Alaric was slowly confronting. People don't always ask for change when they no longer believe change is possible. Serena hadn't stopped caring. She had stopped hoping, and hope, once exhausted, doesn't regenerate easily. Alaric found himself replaying conversations from the past, noticing things he had dismissed at the time. The pauses in Serena's voice, the way she stopped sharing details of her day, the way she grew quieter, not resentful, just absent. Those memories carried weight now. He tried to call her once. He stared at her contact name for a long moment before putting the phone down. Pride rose instinctively, sharp and defensive. Calling felt like surrender, like admitting he might have misjudged the situation. So he didn't. But the silence no longer felt neutral. It felt accusatory. This one of the hardest lessons people learn too late. The absence of conflict does not mean the presence of peace. Serena had removed herself from the conflict, and with it, from the possibility of reconciliation, not because she didn't care, but because caring had already cost her too much. Alaric wasn't broken yet, but the foundation beneath him was cracking. And once cracks form, no amount of success can fully hide them. The quiet house wasn't just empty. It was reflective, and it was beginning to show him parts of himself he had avoided for years. Serena learned something important in the weeks after she left. Peace doesn't arrive all at once. It unfolds. At first, her new life felt unfamiliar, like wearing clothes that hadn't yet shaped themselves to her body. The coastal town moved at a gentler pace than she was used to. Mornings arrived without urgency. Evenings ended without anticipation or disappointment. No one expected her to be anywhere. No one waited on her patience. No one measured her worth by how well she accommodated. That freedom felt strange, but it also felt honest. She rented a small apartment with windows that caught the morning light. The furniture was simple, chosen slowly, intentionally. Each piece felt like a decision made for herself, not for compromise, not for appearance. She found work nearby, nothing glamorous, nothing that impressed strangers. But the work ended when the day ended, and that alone felt revolutionary. For the first time in years, Serena noticed her own thoughts again. She noticed how deeply she slept, how easily she breathed, how laughter returned without effort. Some days, memories surfaced unexpectedly. A phrase, a scent, a version of Alaric that no longer existed. When that happened, she allowed herself to feel the sadness without judging it. Grief, she was learning, didn't mean regret. It meant honesty. She took long walks by the water, letting the steady rhythm of waves remind her that life didn't rush unless forced, that constancy could exist without pressure. That movement didn't always mean forward. It could mean grounded. Little by little, Serena rediscovered parts of herself she hadn't realized she'd buried. Her curiosity, her creativity, her voice. She began reading again, not to fill time, but to nourish herself. She started writing, not with the intention of being heard, but with the relief of being truthful. And in that honesty, she recognized something vital. She hadn't failed at love. She had simply outgrown a version of it that required her to disappear. Education rarely announces itself as such. But this was the lesson Serena was living. Love that costs your identity is too expensive. She didn't hate Alaric. That surprised her. Anger would have been easier, cleaner, more dramatic. But what she felt instead was distance, the kind that allows understanding without reopening wounds. She knew now that staying would have slowly undone her, and knowing that gave her peace. Serena wasn't waiting for an apology. She wasn't hoping for reconciliation. She was building something new, and quietly, without bitterness, without announcement, she began thinking about closure. Not the kind that demands explanation, the kind that offers truth. She didn't know yet what that would look like, but somewhere between morning walks and quiet evenings, an idea began to take shape. One final act, not to reopen the past, but to release it. There was a moment Serena remembered clearly, weeks after she'd settled into her new life, when she caught her reflection in a cafe window and barely recognized herself. Not because she looked different, but because she looked present. Her shoulders were no longer tense. Her eyes held a calm she hadn't felt in years. She was smiling, not out of politeness, not to smooth over someone else's mood, but because she genuinely felt at ease. That, when it truly sank in, she had been surviving for a long time. Now she was living. Reclaiming self-worth didn't come from grand gestures or sudden realizations. It came from small, repeated choices. Choosing rest without guilt. Choosing honesty over endurance. Choosing herself without apology. She stopped explaining her past to people who didn't need to understand it. She stopped framing her departure as something she had to justify. She stopped wondering if she had asked for too much, because she finally understood. Wanting presence is not asking for too much. Wanting to be seen is not unreasonable. Wanting mutual effort is not selfish. Those realizations were freeing. Serena allowed herself to feel proud, not of leaving, but of how she left. With dignity, with compassion, without destroying herself or the person she once loved. She thought about Alaric sometimes, not with bitterness, with clarity. She could see now how ambition had shaped him, how pressure had narrowed his focus, how easily love had become something he assumed instead of something he practiced. Understanding didn't mean excusing. It meant letting go. And it was in that space between understanding and release that Serena decided what she would do next. Closure, she realized, wasn't about reopening conversations. It wasn't about receiving validation or remorse. It was about aligning her actions with her values. She didn't want to leave behind resentment. She wanted to leave behind truth. The idea of the gift formed slowly, not as revenge, not as leverage, but as a final reflection. A mirror held up without accusation. Serena remembered the early years, the dreams Alaric spoke about with so much certainty, the plans he sketched when success was still theoretical, the goals he once believed would bring fulfillment. She also remembered how deeply she had listened, even when he stopped listening to her. The gift would not be emotional. It'd be practical and meaningful in a way that only someone who truly knew him could design. It wouldn't say, "You were wrong." It would say, "This is what you lost." Serena didn't rush the process. She waited until she felt steady, until the decision came from calm, not pain. When it did, she moved quietly, deliberately, without involving anyone who didn't need to know. Because closure, she had learned, doesn't require an audience. And sometimes, the most powerful goodbyes are the ones spoken without sound. Alaric had forgotten the date. That, in itself, was telling. The anniversary passed like any other workday. Meetings stacked back to back, decisions made quickly, praise exchanged in conference rooms with glass walls and polished floors. His assistant reminded him of a late lunch. His phone buzzed constantly. Life moved forward efficiently. It wasn't until late afternoon that the envelope arrived. It was placed neatly on his desk while he was in a meeting. Thick, unmarked, no return address. The receptionist mentioned it briefly, then moved on to the next task. Alaric didn't open it right away. He had learned to treat surprises with caution. In business, nothing arrived without intention. Still, something about the weight of it unsettled him. Not fear, recognition. He waited until the office emptied. When the building quieted and the city lights began to glow outside the windows, he finally sat down and opened it. Inside was a single key and document. He frowned, scanning the first page. Legal language. Property details. His name printed clearly where he least expected it. Confusion came first, then curiosity, then unease. As he read further, realization crept in slowly, like a cold spreading through his chest. The property wasn't new. It had been purchased years ago, early in his rise, back when cash was tight and risk was high. It had been acquired quietly, strategically, in someone else's name. Serena's. He sat back in his chair, heart pounding now, mind racing through memories he hadn't accessed in years. Sketches he had once made on scraps of paper. Conversations he barely remembered having out loud. Dreams he had spoken casually, assuming they would vanish if they didn't materialize. But she had remembered. She had listened. The document confirmed what he was beginning to understand. Serena had invested patiently, wisely, without recognition. The property had appreciated significantly, and now, recently, it had been transferred to him. Alaric stared at the page, unable to move. This wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't generosity in the way he understood it. It felt like something else entirely. There was a second envelope tucked behind the document. Smaller, handwritten, his name, written in a familiar script he hadn't seen in months. He didn't open it immediately. He couldn't, because some part of him already knew that whatever was inside would require him to face something he had avoided since the night she left. Truth, and truth, when delivered calmly, has a way of dismantling even the strongest defenses. Alaric closed his eyes, took a slow breath, and reached for the letter. The key lay beside it on the desk, silent, heavy, unmistakably final. And for the first time since Serena walked out of his life, Alaric felt something unmistakable rise above discomfort. Regret. Alaric unfolded the letter carefully, as if rough handling might change what it said. The handwriting was unmistakable. Steady, calm. The same handwriting that once filled grocery lists, margin notes in books, small reminders left where he would find them and smile, back when he still noticed. He read the first line once, then again, not because it was complicated, but because it was simple in a way that left no room to hide. She didn't accuse him. That was the first thing that struck him. There were no sharp edges in her words, no bitterness disguised as honesty, no attempt to make him feel small. Instead, Serena wrote the way she always had, clearly, thoughtfully, with intention. She wrote about the early years, about the apartment above the bookstore, about listening to him talk through dreams that felt too fragile to share with anyone else, about believing in him when belief was an act of courage, not convenience. She wrote about waiting, not dramatically, not with self-pity, just truthfully. The late nights, the postponed conversations, the gradual quiet. She described the loneliness of being married, but emotionally alone, not as a complaint, but as a reality she had finally learned to name. Then came the line that stopped him cold. "I wanted you to have this," she wrote, "so you would never again confuse success with fulfillment." Alaric felt his throat tighten. He looked back at the document on his desk, the property he had once described with excitement, sketched on paper, dismissed later as unrealistic. The location he had said would make everything feel complete, if he ever owned it. She had remembered, even when he had stopped remembering her. Serena explained that the gift wasn't meant to reopen doors or repair what had already been lost. It wasn't an invitation or a punishment. It was closure. She wrote that she no longer needed to carry the weight of unspoken understanding, that she had reached peace, not by being chosen, but by choosing herself. And then, near the end, she wrote the sentence that dismantled him completely. "This is my last gift to you, not because you deserve it, but because I no longer need to hold on to what you forgot." Alaric lowered the letter slowly. The office felt different now. Smaller, quieter. He understood, finally, what the gift really was. It wasn't the property. It wasn't the money. It was proof that someone had loved him deeply, patiently, and without condition, long after he had stopped being present enough to deserve it. And she had given it to him not out of weakness, but out of strength. Alaric sat there long after the building emptied, the city lights blinking on one by one outside the glass. For the first time in his life, achievement felt hollow, not because it lacked value, but because it had come at a cost he could no longer ignore. Serena hadn't left to hurt him. She had left to save herself, and in doing so, she had handed him the most painful lesson he would ever learn. Some love doesn't ask to be fixed. It simply leaves you with the truth and trusts you to live with it. Alaric tried to call her that night. Not impulsively, not dramatically. He waited until he had read the letter again. Then, once more, as if repetition might dull the impact or reveal a hidden opening he had missed the first time. It didn't. The words stayed exactly where they were. Clear, calm, irreversible. He picked up his phone, scrolled to her name, and pressed call. The line rang once, twice, then stopped. The automated voice told him the number was no longer in service. That was when something inside him finally broke. Not loudly, not visibly, but completely. He sat back in his chair, phone still in his hand, and understood what the silence meant. Serena hadn't left the house. She had closed the door on the version of herself that had waited, hoped, and endured. And she had done it deliberately. Alaric drove home that night without turning on the radio. The city lights blurred past him, familiar streets suddenly feeling foreign. When he entered the house, it felt different than it had before. Not empty, final. He walked through each room slowly, noticing details he had ignored for years. The framed photos he never stopped to look at. The corners of the house that carried traces of her care. Subtle, thoughtful, unacknowledged. He opened the guest room door for the first time. Inside, the space was clean, minimal, exactly how Serena had always kept it. Nothing dramatic, nothing left behind to provoke emotion, just absence. He sat on the edge of the bed and let the weight of the truth settle. She hadn't written the letter to hurt him. She hadn't given the gift to make him regret. She had done both without bitterness. And that, somehow, was what hurt the most. Because anger would have allowed him to argue, to defend, to reframe the past in a way that preserved his self-image. But calm truth offered no such escape. For the first time, Alaric began to see his marriage clearly, not as a failure of love, but as a failure of presence. He remembered moments Serena had tried to connect, questions he brushed past, invitations he postponed, silences he misunderstood. He realized something then that most people only realize when it's too late. Love doesn't end when someone leaves. It ends when someone stops being emotionally available. Serena had stayed long after that moment, and now she was gone. Not because she didn't love him, but because she finally loved herself enough to leave. Alaric lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling Serena had once stared at, wondering how many moments he had mistaken for stability that were actually warnings. The house didn't echo anymore. Judged, and with every breath, he understood the truth Serena had left him with. Some lessons don't come with second chances. They come with clarity. And clarity, once earned, cannot be undone. Alaric didn't sleep that night. He lay in the dark, replaying moments he had once dismissed as insignificant. Not the arguments. There had been so few of those. It was the quiet scenes that haunted him now. Serena standing in the doorway, waiting for him to finish an email, her voice trailing off when he didn't look up. The way she used to ask, "Is now a good time?" And eventually stopped asking at all. At the time, he had interpreted her silence as understanding. Now he recognized it for what it was. Withdrawal. Morning arrived without relief. The sun filled the house, exposing every corner Serena had once softened with intention. Alaric moved through his routine mechanically, but nothing landed the way it used to. He tried to work. He couldn't. For the first time in years, productivity failed him. His mind returned again and again to the same realization, one that tightened his chest every time it surfaced. He hadn't been cruel. He had been careless, and carelessness, he was learning, could be just as destructive. Alaric began searching for her in quiet ways, not through public channels, not with dramatic gestures. He reached out to old acquaintances, mutual connections, who might know where she went. No one did. Serena had closed that chapter with intention. She had left behind no trail to follow, no loose threads to pull. Not because she wanted to disappear, but because she wanted to remain whole. The deeper understanding settled slowly. Serena hadn't left to be chased. She hadn't left to be convinced. She had left because she had already done the work of letting go. That truth hurt more than rejection ever could, because rejection implies choice. This was finality. Alaric began to see his success differently. Each achievement felt slightly hollow. Each milestone a reminder of what had been traded along the way. He realized he had been measuring his life in numbers, growth, scale, expansion, without accounting for what those gains were costing him emotionally. Here's the lesson that arrived too late for him, but not too late for those listening. Presence is not optional in love. It is the foundation. You can miss a call and recover. Miss a dinner and apologize. Miss a moment and still reconnect. But when you miss someone, repeatedly, consistently, they eventually stop waiting to be found. Serena had waited long enough. Alaric stood by the window that evening, watching the city glow beneath him, and understood the cruel symmetry of it all. He had gained everything he once wanted, and lost the one thing he hadn't known he needed. The gift on his desk remained untouched. He didn't move it. He didn't frame it as redemption. He accepted it for what it was, a mirror, and in that reflection, he finally saw the cost of confusing success with fulfillment. Some realizations change your future. Others simply explain your past. This one did both, and it prepared him for the final truth that would define the rest of his life. Alaric searched for Serena longer than he ever admitted to anyone. Not loudly, not desperately, quietly. He revisited old places first. The cafe where they used to sit on weekends, the park where they once talked about children they never had, the bookstore near their old apartment that had somehow survived, while everything else changed. Each place held a version of her that no longer existed. He asked carefully worded questions, listened more than he spoke, accepted vague answers without pressing. No one knew where she was, or if they did, they weren't telling. And slowly, the search itself became a lesson. Serena hadn't disappeared to punish him. She hadn't vanished to be dramatic. She had left in a way that protected her peace. And peace, he was learning, doesn't leave forwarding addresses. There came a moment, standing alone in the house late one evening, when Alaric realized something with sobering clarity. Finding her was no longer the point. Understanding her was. He stopped looking after that, not because he didn't care, but because he finally respected the boundary she had drawn so carefully. Continuing to search would only serve his guilt, not her healing. That realization marked the beginning of a different kind of grief, one without hope of repair, only acceptance. Alaric began living differently, not dramatically, not publicly, but intentionally. He started leaving work earlier, not because someone was waiting for him, but because he no longer wanted to live a life where evenings meant nothing. He learned to sit with silence instead of fleeing from it, to feel discomfort without trying to solve it, to listen, not for response, but for understanding. The house remained quiet, but it no longer felt accusatory. It felt instructional. He kept the letter in a drawer he opened often, not to reopen wounds, but to remember, to remind himself of what neglect looks like when it wears the mask of good intentions. And in that remembering, he finally understood the most painful truth of all. Love does not always ask for change. Sometimes it simply leaves a lesson behind. Alaric would never see Serena again, not because life was cruel, but because love had already given him everything it could. What remained was how he would live with it, and whether the lesson would end. Time did what it always does. It moved forward. Months turned into years, and Alaric Vaughan continued to succeed by every metric the world cared about. His companies expanded. His name carried weight. His decisions shaped futures far beyond his own. But inside him, something had permanently changed. He no longer mistook movement for meaning, or achievement for connection. The absence Serena left behind did not fade. It transformed. It became a quiet guide, shaping how he listened, how he spoke, how he showed up in rooms where once he had only occupied space. He became a different man, not redeemed, not healed in the way stories often promise, but aware. And awareness, he learned, is costly. Every new relationship he encountered, romantic or otherwise, was filtered through the lesson Serena had left him. He noticed when people went quiet. He paid attention to pauses. He understood that silence often carried more truth than words. He no longer waited for conflict to signal damage. He had learned that lesson too late once. He would not learn it again. Alaric never spoke publicly about his marriage, never framed himself as a victim, never softened the truth to make it easier to carry, because the truth didn't need softening. He had been loved deeply. He had failed to protect that love. That knowledge stayed with him, not as punishment, but as responsibility. Some nights he read the letter, not because it still hurt the same way, but because it reminded him of something essential. Love is not proven by longevity. It is proven by presence. Serena, somewhere far from the life she left behind, continued to live quietly, fully, authentically. She did not follow his achievements, did not wonder if he had learned. She didn't need to. Her healing was never dependent on his growth. That, too, was part of the lesson. And so, the story ends not with reconciliation, but with truth. That neglect costs more than attention. That pride costs more than humility. That love, when consistently deprioritized, does not protest forever. It simply leaves. What Serena gave Alaric in the end was not a second chance. It was clarity, and clarity, once earned, cannot be unlearned. That was her final gift, and it changed him forever. Before we close, take a moment to reflect. How many times have we assumed love would wait. That presence could be postponed. That silence meant everything was fine. Serena's story reminds us that the greatest lessons often arrive after the opportunity to fix things has passed. If this story moved you, please like this video. It helps stories with meaning reach people who need them. And if you believe love stories should also teach real-life lessons, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson for more narratives that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What lesson stood out to you the most from this story? Thank you for listening. And remember, presence today prevents regret tomorrow.